In this chapter, we'll go over three key elements of maintaining a Drupal site after it is built. First, we'll talk about deploying a site to production, where the public can view and interact with it. Second, we'll talk about making configuration changes to your Drupal site and moving those to production. And third, we'll talk about keeping your site secure. In this lesson, we'll cover the basics of moving a Drupal site from one environment to another, which is something that you might do when you go from your development environment, whether that's on your local machine, your personal computer, or a remote server, to your production environment where the site will be available to the public. When you're ready to deploy your site or to move it from one environment to another, you need to know that there are three parts to your site, three pieces that must be moved. The first piece is the code. Let's take a look at this. Your Drupal site has a code base, and that code base needs to move. This is everything in your Drupal directory. The second thing that's really important is your files directory, which will be under sites and will likely be under default unless you're using multi-site. Files contains all of the temporal information about your site, including the configuration information. This directory is not typically going to be under version control, so it won't necessarily come with your code if you're using something like Git. The third important component of your site is the database. Because I'm using MAMP to run the site locally, I have access to phpMyAdmin. This is a local database server on my computer, and I have many databases for many Drupal sites here, including the one that is actually behind our site. Everything about this database, both the structure and the data, must come over when I move the site. For the most part, this is going to be content. Now that we're ready to move the site, the first thing we need to do is make the code available in a way that we can move it from one place to another. I have already zipped up the code here into one single zip file. This file also contains the site's default files directory, which is not something that I would normally do when moving a site, because typically the site code would be in version control, and I would be moving the code through the version control process, and then the temporal files would need to be moved separately. But in this case, I've packaged everything into one single zip file, and that's what I'm going to move to my destination. My destination is, for all intents and purposes, another web server. In this case, it's simply going from the directory that I'm using for MAMP, which has one URL path for my sites, to the directory that I'm using for Acquia Dev Desktop, which is another way of having sites run locally and is in a completely different environment. So I'm going to move this zip file over, and then I'm going to unpackage it. I'm going to rename this something a little bit more useful because it is the Drupal site that I'm moving to this new environment. So I'll call it D8 demo site. And now I've taken both the code and I also want to point out that I've brought over the site's default files directory. Now I need the database. There are a few different ways that I can bring the database over. I'm going to talk about two that aren't working in this current version of the Drupal 8 beta at this time. And then we'll finish up with the one that is working right now because of Acquia Dev Desktop. The two that aren't currently working are the ones that you're more likely to use, and that's why I want to bring them up. The first option may be a little bit more difficult if you've never been exposed to phpMyAdmin before. So let's go take a look at phpMyAdmin. And as I mentioned before, this is the database for this particular site. I can use phpMyAdmin to export a version of this database. And in this case, I would save the output to a file. I would compress it, otherwise it might be quite large. I can leave everything else the same, and then I would click Go. Unfortunately, with the current version of Drupal 8 and the version of MySQL that's being used here, only part of the database has actually been downloaded into that file. So this isn't going to work. However, if it were going to work, then what I could do in the production environment is go into phpMyAdmin or whatever tool I have for managing my database server, and then I can go to Databases and create a new database. Once I have that new database, then I can go ahead and use Import to bring that file in to that database, and it will fill out the tables and structure exactly with the data that came from my site, from whatever origin environment I started with. The other easier way to do this is using a module called Backup and Migrate. This is a contributed module and does not require any knowledge of or access to PHPMyAdmin. I cannot demonstrate this at all right now because as of the time of recording this video, the current version of Backup and Migrate, combined with the current beta of Drupal 8, causes the site to white screen. Check back with this chapter once Drupal 8 is released, as we will be patching the videos in this chapter when everything is working as expected. Now that we've talked about the two ways that you're more likely to actually work with your database and bring it from the origin to the destination environment, we're going to go ahead and move over to the third option, which is the least likely one that you're going to use unless you're setting up the site locally or in an environment where you're using Acquia Dev Desktop. I'm going to start with an existing Drupal site located on my computer. But rather than using this dialog, let's pretend that I already had Acquia Dev Desktop open. Let's move this up a little so that you can see everything on the screen. Down in the bottom left here is this little plus icon. I can click on that and say Import Local Drupal Site. The code base that I want is the code that I moved over earlier. So we're going to go ahead and locate that, which is Drupal 8 demo site. Click Open. I'm going to leave everything default here except the database line. Rather than create a new database, I want to start by importing from another MySQL server. This is going to create a copy of the database in the new environment. The location of your origin MySQL server is going to be different from mine. I happen to know that mine is localhost and the port is 8889. This is because I'm using MAMP on my system. If you're using a different system, then you'll have a different URL and a different port number. If you're using an online service, then you'll have a full URL and you may not have a port number. I'm also going to go ahead and add the username and password for this database server. Now I'll click Get List, and it'll get a list of all of the databases that are available to me on this server or available to the username and password that I entered. And now I can go ahead and select the one that I know belongs to the site that I'm moving, which is this D810 here for Drupal 8 Beta 10. I'll click on that, and now I'll select OK. Now remember that this is not going to cause my site to look at that database server, but rather it's going to create a new database on the Acquia Dev Desktop database server with all of the data and the structure for me. And I'll say OK. This warning is okay. I do want to move this site to this new location. I'm not worried about it working in the old location right now because all of this code is in my new location. It's not touching my local environment. And then I'll say yes. And now it's going to set up this site. So now I have two sites in Acquia Dev Desktop. I have the one that we're looking at right now, the one that we moved from another environment, and then I have just a plain vanilla Drupal beta version 10 that I also set up previously. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the new site that we've set up in our new environment. I'm going to click on it, and it's going to take me to a page that should show me the site. In fact, it should look pretty much exactly like this, which is our local version. Unfortunately, what I get is this error: the provided hostname is not valid for this server. This is because of a handy security feature that is new in Drupal 8 that we addressed in a previous lesson in this course. Since we packaged our code up exactly and moved it to our new environment, including the settings.php file, we have a settings.php file that is customized for our local environment. Specifically, we've set the trusted host patterns in our settings.php file to only trust localhost 2. What we need to do is edit this settings.php file to accept the pattern for this particular site, which is d8demosite.dd. So let's move back over to our code here, and under Sites, Default, we're going to find settings.php, and we're going to go ahead and open that up. And it'll open in my code editor. I'm going to do a quick find here for the word trusted to see if we can jump down to this more quickly. Notice all this help text that's going to help me set this up correctly. And here's where we have the line that says, Trusted Host Patterns, Localhost 2. I'm a big fan of copy and paste so that we get everything right. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste d8demosite.dd. I'll copy that, and then we'll go back to Coda, and I'm going to paste the actual host information that we want in there. I don't need these slashes, and I don't need the http://. Okay, so hopefully that's set. If not, then we'll take more dramatic measures to make sure that we can save this file. I'll go ahead and quit Coda here. And now we can go back to our site and reload and see if this solves the problem. And there we go. Now we have an exact replica of the site that we have on our local environment, the only difference being I'm not actually logged in at this moment in time. And we can go ahead and start working with the site in what we're currently considering our production environment. I want to point out that the best way to store and move your Drupal code is with Git. Git is a tool for version control. It's also wonderful for collaboration, and as it says on the GitHub website, it's great for collaboration, code review, and code management. GitHub is a tool specifically designed for Git, but there are many other tools out there that enable you to use Git for your version control for your code. Git is beyond the context of this course. There is another O'Reilly video that I want to point out. This video is from Emma Jane Hogben Westby, also known as Emma Jane on Drupal.org. It is titled Collaborating with Git, and it will be a very helpful course for you if you are looking to do any sort of Drupal development long term, because version control is really valuable in the Drupal world. In fact, it's valuable in web development or software development in general. In this lesson, we reviewed moving your Drupal site from one environment to another. Next, we will take a look at moving configuration changes after you have cloned a site in another environment.